Well, India and Pakistan have reached a ceasefire, and yet it raises more questions than it answers. Like, whether there was a ceasefire at all. But that uncertainty is a good starting point for us, because a ceasefire is not the end of a conflict. It is literally a ceasing of fire. Whether it will last will depend on what happens at the next round of talks. And even if that leads to a longer period of peace, it certainly will not resolve the underlying substantive problem between the two. With that in mind, unfortunately, there is a long-term issue involving the United States. It is called the Bottleneck Problem. Today, we are going to see why this tangled web is a gigantic problem for these two in particular. An important caveat first, though. There are a couple of competing narratives about what happened with this particular ceasefire. The Trump administration claims that it was on the phone overnight negotiating the entire thing. Pakistan corroborated this account and thanked Trump, while Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced a trilateral meeting to hammer out the further details. India, meanwhile, indicated that the ceasefire was a bilateral agreement and that there were no plans for future talks. It is unclear what to make of the diverging narratives. After having struggled to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine, though, you can see why the Trump administration would want a public relations win. If the United States were a key player in brokering a ceasefire, the question remains what Washington brought to the table to change anyone's mind in the subcontinent. Because, as we have all learned with the ceasefire talks between Russia and Ukraine, third parties actually have to do something to move the parties toward peace. And regardless of what happened this time, the question remains what Washington might be able to do the next time that something like this happens. Because, historically, the United States has played a pivotal role in stopping a war between the two regional powers. Flashback to the George H.W. Bush era. India and Pakistan got into a scuffle over, guess where? Kashmir. And they seemed to be on the brink of a war. Bush deployed Robert Gates to try to resolve the problem. At the time, Gates was the Deputy National Security Advisor. However, you may know him better as the head of the CIA, a promotion he would receive a year later, or through his time as Secretary of Defense under W. Bush and Obama. And you almost have certainly seen a photo of him before. Anyway, Gates flew to both countries and told them to pretty please stop it. Well, guess what? They did. That's right. You just talked to them, and they stopped. Now, before you think that India and Pakistan committed the cardinal sin of listening to what a leader said, there was a sensible logic here. You see, Gates came armed with the most powerful weapon possible, US war games. He first went to Pakistan and laid out the results. If you fight the war, you will lose. He then flew to India and reported that India would indeed win, but it would come at too high of a cost to be worthwhile. Unlike the bluster that you hear from politicians, which can and should be dismissed, Gates was relaying verifiable information to each party, emphasis on verifiable. There was no need to take him at his word. He could walk them through what US wargaming had found out, and explain to them why he was right. Well, we all know that if everyone could just agree to what the expected outcome is, settling short of a war should be no problem. And that is exactly what Gates was doing on his trip. Fast forward to today, and no such relief is in sight. The credibility issue strikes again. Washington would really prefer it if they just stopped fighting. There is no reason to sour relations with Pakistan, but Trump especially would like a strong India to counterbalance China. There is also the inconvenient fact that India is a major player in global supply chains, so a sustained major war on the subcontinent would likely trigger a worldwide recession. But a bias for peace makes the United States an unreliable narrator, and in this case also an unreliable mediator. No one is about to take Rubio or anyone else at their word. Fortunately, as Gates demonstrated 35 years ago, verifiable information provides a solution. Unfortunately, though, we run into a much bigger problem here. I think it is worth going on an extended side mission to untangle the very complicated web of war that we now live in, because it matters for explaining what exactly is going on with that bottleneck problem. Take a deep breath, because this is the world that we are living in right now. And while we are not experiencing World War III yet, it is a world at war. What I mean is that we do not have clear sides squaring off in simultaneous conflicts, like you had during World War II. But all of the main battle lines right now are interconnected in some way. So, our task for the next few minutes is to walk through the complicated web and see why it should concern us about the global management of the latest India-Pakistan crisis. Let's start with the timeline. February 24th, 2022. Early in the morning, Vladimir Putin went onto Russian television to declare a special military operation against Ukraine. For the following month or so, the conflict was mostly bilateral. The West expected that Russia would win fairly quickly, and so any assistance would be for naught. That concern went double for the Biden administration. The political scars from the mess of the withdrawal from Afghanistan projected onto this front. There could not be a second time in rapid succession that U.S. enemies captured brand new American kit. However, after Ukraine's victory in the Battle of Kyiv, it became clear that the West could receive a nice return on investment by sending equipment. Thus came the ammunition, artillery pieces, and eventually HIMARS. The war was internationalized, even if the fighting was bilateral. China and India also financially supported Russia by not taking part in the sanctions regime placed against Moscow, but we will get back to them later. The next domino to fall was in the Middle East. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a surprise raid into Israel, the first salvo of the Gaza war. There was no direct connection between the two fronts. Rather, the international concern that Hamas had was between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and, eventually, Iran. A few years earlier, Israel had made peace with some of its neighbors, and there was a suspicion that Saudi Arabia would be next. That would allow Israel and Saudi Arabia to form a coalition against a more important and shared threat in the region, Iran. But that would be bad for Iran, and also its axis of resistance partner Hamas. So Hamas attacked Israel, and that put any Saudi-Israeli treaty on the back burner. Direct connections to Ukraine or not, though, the indirect connections soon became evident. Remember these from earlier? They are 155mm artillery shells, and in a land war, there is an endless demand for them. However, thanks to the West enjoying the post-Cold War peace dividend, 155mm production from coalition countries had plummeted over the prior decades. Soon, Western countries had to decide whether Ukraine or Israel should receive their surpluses. And shortly after that, the Israeli conflict expanded along the Red Sea with the Houthis. As one might expect, this naval crisis brought the United States into the conflict, as the Houthi attacks scared off international shipping. Hence, Operation Prosperity Guardian deployed an aircraft carrier and other vessels into the region, hoping to re-establish freedom of navigation and allow the Suez Canal to return to being a shortcut between Europe and Asia. Concurrent to all of that happening, Israel and Hezbollah opened up a northern front, which then intertwined Iran into the conflict on a much clearer level than was the case before. And now you start getting weird connections. Iran's increased activity in the region was made possible by the money that Russia was sending to Tehran to buy drones that would then hit Ukraine. Fast forward to August 6, 2024, and Ukraine entered Kursk, which then led to Russia enlisting North Korea for backup. And that provides a good transition to the Cold War portion of our increasingly tangled web. Russia and China, of course, were already entangled via their limitless friendship. With Trump's election in November 2024, though, U.S. attention shifted to China and the threat of an invasion of Taiwan, which might involve Vietnam and the Philippines, but would inevitably bring in the United States, Japan, and South Korea to the mix, so North Korea may as well play along. Trump has also been busy threatening Iran over the latter's nuclear program, and up until a few weeks ago, that seemed to be the most likely place that a new war would begin. However, that has taken a backseat to the newest battle of the day, India and Pakistan. The allegiances here get confusing. In recent history, the United States worked closely with Pakistan, as the country served as a vital supply route for the mission in Afghanistan. Nevertheless, India has disputed borders with both Pakistan and China. Thus, Beijing would have to worry about India making a play during an invasion of Taiwan, while India would have to worry about Pakistan taking advantage of India taking advantage of China, which is why Pakistan and China have been working together as of late. Whew, that was complicated. And let's not forget that India is still purchasing cheap oil from Russia, even if there is no military coalition there. That is how you end up with a map that looks like this. Let's just count our blessings that I skipped over Syria, which we could take off the map following the fall of Assad. And that finally takes us back to today. Remember that the United States needs to actually do something to convince warring parties to reach a ceasefire. Begging does not get very far when you cannot credibly follow through on threats of punishment, like what we have seen with Russia. And if you want to go with the information provision route, you better show your work and make a compelling argument as to why it is correct. But this is where the bottleneck problem arises. It does not matter how full the bottle is. All of the water has to come out of a narrow neck, and that neck determines how much you can pour at a time. Well, back to the web. These are the US problems right now. At best, India-Pakistan is the fifth highest priority for the US national security regime, behind the cold conflict with China, Russia's war against Ukraine, the US intervention in Yemen, even if it is on timeout, and preparations for a conflict against Iran. Heck, you could probably also throw in support for Israel in the Gaza war. Then, finally, maybe you get to India-Pakistan. Welcome to the bottleneck problem. It does not matter how many priorities you have, they are all limited by the bottleneck. To make matters worse, an endless number of national security officials that I have spoken to over the last couple of months have noted how dealing with the Trump administration's various bureaucratic reforms have substantially cut the number of productive working hours. The problem is even present at the top, with Marco Rubio currently juggling 4 separate roles in the White House. Hey, can you name them all? I could not either. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor are the easy ones, but he is also the archivist and the administrator of USAID, though maybe he is not actually doing much with that last one. Anyway, the point is that there is little time to wargame, and specifically an India-Pakistan wargame would be at the bottom of the list. Consequently, if a modern-day Robert Gates wanted to repeat his 1990s strategy, he would quickly discover that no one on the subcontinent would be willing to listen to him. Remember, for words to matter in this context, you need to bring verifiable information to the table. Well, the competing priorities are preventing that from happening. The alternative solutions here would be to subsidize the peace by offering some sort of financial sweetener, or to threaten to donate military supplies to one's opponent if one fails to yield. However, the Trump administration is notoriously stingy when it comes to handing out what are effectively aid dollars to foreign governments. Meanwhile, the United States cannot even leverage Russia by threatening to arm Ukraine, because Moscow knows that Trump would rather arm Taiwan. And even aside from that, if you remember all of these weapon systems from earlier, some of them will still make their way to Ukraine in some fashion, and some of them may go to Israel, and you may yet need others for the Houthis or Iran. The bottleneck problem strikes again. Now, that is not to say that recurring war between India and Pakistan is inevitable, but it does mean that the US backstop is gone, and that is a problem in the current crisis, and it will remain a problem even if a prolonged ceasefire takes effect, but similar tensions arise in the upcoming months or years. If you want to learn more about the conflict between India and Pakistan, I answered a bunch of viewer questions earlier today over on Lines on Maps Extra. It was before the ceasefire was declared, but given how tenuous the situation is, all of the information is still relevant. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.